The Man Who Arrived in Shadows. Hit subscribe if you dare, because after this story, you'll never see a prison cell the same way again. The alarms were already blaring across Times Square when the SUV began smoking. It was May 2010. Crowds scattered, officers shouted warnings, and firefighters surged forward with the fear of a detonation ticking behind their eyes. The improvised device never fully ignited, but the message was clear. Someone had tried to unleash mass tragedy in one of the most densely packed corners of America. Within hours, investigators were combing through surveillance tapes, tracking heat signatures, and chasing a man who had slipped through airports, street cameras, and neighborhoods without leaving a trace of hesitation behind. Faisal Shahzad was caught 2 days later, pulled from an aircraft moments before takeoff. But his capture didn't end the threat. Federal agents interviewing him behind reinforced glass reported something that unsettled even the most experienced among them. He was calm, too calm. No panic, no fear of consequences, no concern about life in a federal supermax. He spoke with an eerie composure that raised new questions. How far had his training gone? And what were the risks of placing someone like him inside a facility already housing the most dangerous individuals in the country? His conviction sent him to ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, the prison built to contain inmates who could not be contained anywhere else. But his arrival didn't feel like the others. Staff members, already accustomed to handling cartel leaders, organized crime figures, and domestic terrorists, noted something different. Shahzad showed no remorse, no emotional response, no shift in demeanor. For the Bureau of Prisons, that wasn't just unsettling. It was a structural threat. The moment he stepped through the steel portals of ADX, internal protocols began shifting. Officers tightened escort procedures, reduced cell-to-cell proximity checks, and initiated new monitoring logs designed specifically for inmates with ideological motives. The warden at the time received a detailed advisory stating that inmates motivated by extremist ideology pose unique risks: covert communication, symbolic behaviors, radicalization attempts, and long-term refusal to cooperate with standard confinement psychology. In Shahzad's case, officials worried not about escape attempts, but about influence. Ideas spreading silently, invisibly, through brief interactions, body language, or coded gestures. Still, no one at ADX yet understood how quickly changes would follow. On an icy Colorado morning, guards performed a security sweep of Range 13, the most secure block in the prison. Shahzad sat on the edge of his slab bed, staring straight ahead, motionless. When officers executed a routine check of his meal hatch, he didn't look at them, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge their presence. For most inmates, isolation eroded confidence, posture, even the spark behind their eyes. He seemed untouched by it. Observations were logged, supervisors alerted, prison psychologists reviewed transcripts and reported something unusual. He was unresponsive to typical behavioral pressure points that ADX relied on to measure risk. That meant unpredictability. Unpredictability meant a breach was always theoretically possible. And at ADX, where every step, every movement, every second was engineered to prevent the slightest crack, that possibility terrified everyone. Investigators digging deeper into his pre-incarceration records uncovered something else: methods of evading surveillance that didn't appear in his criminal file. Systems analysts reported subtle anomalies in digital patterns he left behind. Agents began to suspect that even his capture might not have revealed everything about his operational past. For the first time in years, ADX Florence initiated a quiet internal review, not of an inmate's behavior, but of their own. Protocols were expanded. Camera check intervals were shortened. Intelligence sharing between agencies increased. Shahzad had become a catalyst, not through violence behind bars, but through the chilling possibility that he knew more than he had ever said. And then, during one of the routine inspections of his cell, officers found something that wasn't there the night before. Something small, something subtle, something that should have been impossible inside the most secure prison in the United States. When they opened the sealed evidence box later that night, what they found changed everything. The blueprint of a threat. The silence inside ADX Florence was never just quiet. It was a pressure, a weight, the kind that sank into concrete, into steel, into bone. By the time the sun rose over the Rocky Mountains of morning after Shahzad's arrival, the entire facility was already running under a new, unspoken tension. Officers didn't say it out loud, but they all felt it. The prison was studying him just as much as they were studying the prison. Inside the warden's office, Captain Rourke stood over the case files scattered across a metal table. The room was lit by a single overhead bulb, buzzing faintly. A blueprint of ADX lay open in front of him. Coded corridors, restricted wings, emergency response locks, and next to it, a stack of reports from intelligence agencies, each one stamped with warnings about Shahzad's ideological commitment, his training history, his psychological resilience. Rourke wasn't new to danger. He dealt with cartel assassins, mob captains, and killers who could slit a throat without blinking. But Shahzad was different. Men like him didn't fear isolation. They fed on it. They sharpened themselves inside it. Down the hall, 2 officers escorted Shahzad to his first psychological evaluation. He walked with calm, controlled steps, hands cuffed, eyes forward. No twitching, no hesitation, no signs of the stress that usually crack new inmates entering Supermax. His expression stayed steady, almost serene. Dr. Helms, the prison psychologist, watched him enter her office. Her notes were ready. She had evaluated some of the worst criminals in the country. But the moment Shahzad sat across from her, she sensed a different kind of stillness. Not emptiness, but conviction. "Mr. Shahzad," she began, "this evaluation helps us determine your risk level." He leaned back slightly, not relaxed, just observant. "I assume you've already decided who I am. We assess everyone individually." "You assess actions," he said quietly. "You don't assess belief." The sentence made her pause. Most prisoners beg for better conditions, more time, more privileges. Not him. His voice held no anger, no fear, no desperation, only certainty. On the other side of the glass wall, officers watched every movement. They weren't looking for violence. They were looking for intent. Any micro-expression, any shift in posture, anything that suggested hidden planning. Shahzad gave them none. Later that afternoon, the security team met in the lower operations center. Screens displayed every angle of Shahzad's cell. The steel bed, the fixed table, the narrow concrete floor. Nothing inside could be turned into a weapon. Yet Rourke couldn't shake the feeling that the danger here wasn't physical. It was psychological, ideological, strategic. "He's not probing for weaknesses," an officer reported. "He's not testing guards or watching camera blind spots." "That's the problem," Rourke muttered. "The most dangerous ones don't need to." That night, Officer Delgado was assigned to the second shift cell check routine. He'd been at ADX for 8 years. He thought he'd seen every type of inmate behavior, from breakdowns to rage to complete withdrawal. But when he stopped at Shahzad's door during the 11 p.m. check, he froze. Shahzad wasn't pacing. He wasn't sleeping. He wasn't reading. He was sitting perfectly still on the floor, back straight, eyes open, staring at the small slit of moonlight cutting across the wall. He didn't look at Delgado. He didn't react at all. Delgado swallowed. Something about the posture, the stillness, crawled under his skin. It felt intentional. It felt like discipline. It felt like preparation. The next morning, during briefing, Delgado reported what he saw. Rourke listened without interrupting. "You think he was trying to send a message?" one officer asked. "No," Delgado answered quietly. "I think he was reminding himself of one." Rourke closed the file in front of him. From that day forward, new protocols were drafted. Changes in observation timing, randomized routes, modified psychological profiles. Shahzad hadn't made a single threat, yet the facility reshaped itself around him like a fortress tightening its armor. Because sometimes the greatest danger wasn't what an inmate did. It was what he was capable of waiting for. When the meeting ended and officers dispersed, Rourke remained alone in the operations room. He stared up at the camera feed of Shahzad's cell. The man hadn't moved from his position. And that was when Rourke realized something unsettling, something none of them had prepared for. Shahzad wasn't adapting to ADX. ADX was adapting to him. The cell that changed the system. The morning the crisis began, nothing looked different. The sky above ADX Florence was pale and cloudless. The yard was empty. The corridors were cold and echoing. Officers performed their rounds with the same rigid precision as every day before it. But by 9:12 a.m., everything inside the most secure prison in America had shifted into a silent, tightening spiral, and it all started with one missing report. In the central control booth, Officer Klein reviewed the overnight surveillance logs. Every inmate had been accounted for except one, a gap in Shahzad's behavioral pattern. Not an escape, not a breach, just missing data. A 36-minute window when he had remained out of sight, not moving, not pacing, not reading, and the camera had briefly glitched. A single frame drop, a flicker, one lost moment in an unbroken chain of surveillance. At any other prison, it would have been meaningless. At ADX, it was cause for alarm. Captain Rourke arrived within minutes. He stood behind Klein, staring at the screen while the glitch replayed. Shahzad's cell was empty for a fraction of a second, a smear of digital static, and then he appeared again, sitting on the edge of his bed, staring directly into the lens, not blinking, not breathing, practically waiting for someone to notice. Run a full diagnostic, Rourke ordered. Klein swallowed. Sir, it's not the camera. It's the system. The glitch came from the internal feed relay. Rourke's jaw tightened. Only 3 inmates in ADX history had ever caused internal relay failures, and each time it forced the facility to rewrite security protocols from the ground up. But those inmates left traces, scratched wires, manipulated screws, torn insulation. Shahzad hadn't touched anything. Meanwhile, in the underground psychological wing, Dr. Helms reviewed Shahzad's latest evaluation notes. There were no outbursts, no threats, no requests. His calm was absolute, too absolute. His answers were precise, stripped of emotion yet not robotic. He was engaged but never reactive, strategic but never aggressive. She replayed a recorded session from earlier that week. At one point she asked him how he viewed his confinement, punishment, consequence cleansing, or endurance. He had paused for a long moment. Then he said, "Confinement is a test. And tests are never about comfort. They're about control." Dr. Helms exhaled slowly as she closed the file. Back in the operations center, officers scrambled through diagnostics, rewinding footage frame by frame. The glitch wasn't an accident. It wasn't a malfunction. It was timing, precise, purposeful timing. The system flickered at the exact moment 2 patrol routes intersected and 2 angles of surveillance overlapped, creating a blind micro-interval. Shahzad hadn't hacked anything. He had simply predicted the system's rhythm, and that terrified Rourke. At 10:47 a.m., he made a decision no officer at ADX ever made lightly, a surprise cell extraction drill. Not because Shahzad was violent, but because Rourke needed to understand the scope of what he was dealing with. Extraction teams moved silently through the corridor in layered armor, shields up, batons drawn, riot mesh visors down. When they reached Shahzad's door, Rourke gave a nod. The steel slid open. Shahzad was already standing, hands behind his back, eyes calm, body still, not resisting, not surprised, prepared. The team froze just long enough for the unease to spread like ice. Rourke stepped forward. "You knew we were coming." Shahzad tilted his head slightly, not smug, not mocking, simply aware. "Patterns," he said softly. "Your system runs on them. Even your unpredictability has a pattern." The extraction team tensed. Rourke's stomach dropped. This wasn't a threat. This wasn't defiance. This was analysis. A man mapping the behavior of a supermax facility the way others might study tides or weather. And that meant something far more dangerous. He wasn't looking for escape. He was looking to understand control. After the drill ended, Rourke locked himself in the operations room, reviewing the patterns again. Shift rotations, meal distribution timing, camera cycle resets. And he finally saw what Shahzad saw. The system breathed. It expanded and contracted in predictable intervals. It wasn't a fortress. It was a heartbeat. And anyone patient enough could learn its rhythm. By evening, new emergency protocols were ordered. Randomized route shifts. Triple redundancy camera checks. Isolation timing variations. Psychological reevaluation mandates. An overhaul so deep that the very architecture of ADX's routine changed. All because one inmate, without touching a single wire or making a single threat, managed to expose the prison's greatest weakness: predictability. That night, as officers whispered through the halls, one sentence repeated among them like a ghost: he changed the prison without ever leaving his cell. And they were right. Some stories of danger come from violence. Others come from intent. But the rarest, most terrifying ones come from intelligence sharpened by absolute isolation, the kind that can remake a system from the inside out. Rourke stared into the surveillance screen long after the shift ended, watching Shahzad sit motionless, eyes on the far wall, as if he were listening to the facility breathe. And for the first time in his career, Rourke understood a truth he wished he had never learned. Some inmates don't wait for weakness. They wait for understanding. And once they understand, the entire system has to change to survive them. If the story was good, hit like in others.